Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devu.com. In this lesson, things are going to get a little bit more interesting. Based on the user's input, we're going to write logic to execute either one block of code or a different block of code. All right, so when I use the term logic, I mean that we're going to make a decision to execute one block of code or another block of code based on some condition, like, for example, the user's input, or maybe the state of the computer, the system itself that we're working in, or some other data that we have available to us. We're going to decide what to do with that input, with that data, and then react accordingly. All right. So what we're going to do is create a new project. I'm going to call it Decisions. So again, Visual Basic Console application. We're going to call this Decisions and click OK. And I'm just going to start writing some code. So again, what you want to do is pause while I'm typing this and type it along with me, and then I'll explain what it does. Now, I'm willing to bet that you can figure out what this does even without my explanation, because at this point things are so easy. But let's go ahead and just write it together, and then we'll go on and talk about it. All right, so here we go. Alrighty, there we go. So I think probably most of this would make sense as you look at it on my screen. The one thing that might look new to you is the if statement that we have here in lines 10 and the end if in line 12. And notice that there's this level of indentation then, creating essentially a code block in between the if and end if statements. All right. So we've set up this condition if the user value is equal to 1. So if the value that the user typed in when prompted is 1, then what we want to do is set this variable message equal to the string value you want a new car, and then print that out to screen. So let's go ahead and run the application and just make sure it runs in this very simple case, which I'm pretty sure it will. When I hit 1 on my keyboard and hit enter, hey, we want a new car. But what we have not accounted for are the other cases. So for example, 2, nothing happens. And the same would be true even if we typed in something like Bob and hit enter. Nothing happens. All right. So first of all, we want to talk about the evaluation operator. It is the equal sign, so it's playing double duty. We can use it as an assignment to set the value of message equal to the value of some string, like you want a new car. But when it's used in the context of an if statement, here we're going to do an evaluation. Is this true? Does user value equal the number 1 or the string value 1? All right. If it does, then execute the block of code that's defined between the if and the end if. If this is false, so when I typed the number 2 or when I typed in the word Bob, then that's false, and we do not execute the values inside of that code block. Okay, so that is what I meant by making decisions. We're building logic and executing that logic, and then based on the input of the user, we'll decide what to display or what code to execute in a more general sense, whether we execute this block of code inside of the if statement or not. All right, so again, in This case, this is using the equal sign as an assignment operator. This is the evaluation or the equality operator. Okay. So what happens then if we want to try different combinations? Well, I guess what we could do is then start a whole new if statement. So if user value equals 2, then we can set the message equal to you won a new boat. And I'm willing to bet that that would work, but there's a more simplified version of this. Let's go ahead and just delete that, because what we can do is inside that same if block, we can create additional checks called else if statements. All right, so if the user value equals 1 is not true, then we're not going to execute this block of code. But what we will do is then move down to the next check. And in this case, else if user value equals 2. All right. And if that's the case, then we'll set the message equal to you won a new boat. I could also do else if user value equals 3. Message equals you won a new cat. All right. And then finally, what if none of these are true? What if none of them are true? And at this point, then, if we run the application and I type in the word Bob, I get nothing. All right. Well, there's one of two ways I can handle that. In this simple scenario, I could assign the value of string to initially to bad input, like so. So it would, none of these conditions would register, and therefore it would just stay at its default value, bad input, and that would be printed to screen. So here, Bob, bad input. But what I'd really like to illustrate for our purposes here, just so you can see, the last part of an if, else if, end if statement is just the simple else statement. And in this case, we're saying if this is not true, and this is not true, and this is not true, then, all right, well, this is the catch-all. Otherwise, just do this. In this case, we'll just set the message equal to bad input. Please try again. All right, or something like you lose, or whatever the case might be. And so this time, whenever we run the application, we type in Bob and hit enter, bad input. All right, great. I want you to notice something, how I designed this code. I could have, in each of these cases, just done console.writeLine and then said you won a new car, like so. All right. I would have had to add the console.writeLine in each of these else if statements and in the else statement as well. However, what I chose to do instead was just to define a variable and have it store the message that I want displayed, and then just call the console.writeLine a single time here at the very bottom. All right, so that's just a way to simplify the code, to structure the code in a very logical, easy to maintain sort of way. If I wanted to change how this message is displayed, I might have to change it in several different places. So for example, I might want to change, whoops, let's do this, and say result, colon, space, and then display the message. I would have to make a change to every one of these code blocks if I had written the value out. But now I can just make a change in one place and just display then the message after it. So just be cognizant of the fact that you can simplify your code and you can expand its functionality while reducing the amount of maintenance that has to happen in order to add new functionality. So I feel like I've accomplished that in this case by just kind of using this message variable to store the actual message and then only using console.writeLine one time in my application. All right. So finally, what I want to demonstrate to you is I'm going to comment all of this out. And in some cases, you don't need the if, else, end if. You can use something just called the conditional method. So there's a method called if with an I, two I's, IIF, and then an opening and closing curly braces. Now, in this first part, what we want to do is set the expression. So let me actually grab some code from earlier here, and we'll grab these first 3 lines of code, and I'm going to select them all and then use the button that's right next to the comment out the selected lines, and this is the uncomment the selected lines, and that will remove the little comments from each line of code. All right, so now we have the user value again, and here what I want to do is if IIF, open and close parentheses, user value equals the value of 1, then after that 1, I'm going to use a comma, and you can see I can add a true part and a false part. So here what I'll do is say the true part is car, but for everything else, if that's user value is not equal to 1, then I'll say you just want a free cat. All right. So let me do this. I'm going to go dim message as string equals empty string, and then message equals if the user value is 1, then I'll give them a car, but anything else they'll win a cat. And then we'll do console.writeLine, the message, and then finally console.readLine to stop the execution. And now let's run the application. And I'm going to type in the number 1. Great. And then I'm going to type in the value Bob. And I want a cat. I guess I need to improve this just a little bit and do this. U1A, and there's the message. And I might even just add an ampersand, and then I'm going to put a period to make the end of the sentence like that. Okay? Oh, I have a better idea. Let's fix this. I don't like that. That's a lot of concatenation. There's an easier way to do this. And I'll explain this this syntax a little bit later, but inside of that string, what I'm going to do is add replacement syntax. And there's some special features of replacement syntax that we're going to see in an upcoming lesson that will allow us to format what we put in here. Like if we have a date or a currency value, we can do some really neat things. But for right now, I'll just use U1A curly brace 0 curly brace, double quote, and then I'm going to use a comma after that, and then put in the message, like so, okay? Now I need to explain these commas inside of the opening and closing parentheses. You see that we have this if conditional method here, and we used a bunch of commas. What those are, it allows us to separate the input parameters to each of those methods. So sometimes a method only will accept a single input parameter like console.writeLine. Now, console.writeLine can also accept 2 parameters or more. In this case, we're going to give it a string and then a value that could be used in replacement whenever it comes across a replacement code. Again, we'll talk about replacement codes at length a little bit later, but you can see here I'm passing in 2 parameters to the WriteLine method by using a comma in between them. Here we're using 3 input parameters by using 2 commas. Here we do the evaluation. Is this going to be true or false? If it is true, then we give it the true part, and then if it's false, we give it the false part. And whatever's returned back from this method, whether it's car or cat, it'll be assigned into our message variable, which will then be added to our U1A, and then we'll replace whatever that replacement code is, whatever it's either car or cat, and then we'll add an exclamation mark at the end. All right, so now let's run the application again. And here I'll type in the number 1, you want car. See how that formatted it nicely? And we'll run it again. And this time we'll type in the number 4, you want a cat. Okay. All right. So we learned quite a bit in this lesson, just tacking on some additional features of Visual Basic. We looked at, most importantly, the if, and else if, and else, and end if statements in order to add some conditional logic to our applications. So we made some decisions, and based on values and evaluating the truthiness or falsiness of a particular expression, we're going to execute one of the code blocks inside of our if, else, and if code block. All right. We also looked at this magical if IIF method, which allows us to, again, evaluate true or false, and then return either a true or a false value that we can then like assign to a variable in this case. Then we also talked about how to add multiple items into input parameters using commas to separate each of the values in the input parameter. And then finally, we talked about this replacement syntax with curly braces and with the number 0 inside of it, and how we're able to replace a part of the string that we're giving to WriteLine by using the replacement code and then passing it the value we want to be stuck into that template, okay, for display. All right, so you're doing great. We're learning a lot, and let's continue on. We're going to keep adding on the complexity and make our applications more and more interesting. See you in the next video.